For 4 years, Dubai hid something embarrassing in plain sight. A crater the size of several city blocks, ringed by rusting equipment and faded construction signage, sitting directly across from one of the most photographed skylines on the planet. You could see it from the water. You could see it from the air. Tourists on dhow cruises past Creek Harbor would sometimes point, and their guides would pivot the conversation towards something else. The hole was too large to ignore and too inconvenient to explain. That hole cost over $1 billion to create. And then, for reasons that were never fully disclosed to the public, the work stopped. Now, for the first time in years, that's changing. Engineers are back at the site. MR Properties is using language in its public communications that it hasn't used since 2019. Specific language, commissioning language, the kind that signals real intention rather than maintained appearances. Santiago Calatrava's extraordinary design is circulating again across architecture platforms and investment forums. Dubai Creek Tower, the structure that was supposed to make the Burj Khalifa look like an opening act, is, apparently, finally rising. But finally rising doesn't begin to cover what actually happened here. $1 billion infrastructure project doesn't pause for half a decade and restart without a story buried in the foundation. There are investors who lived through years of uncertainty with their capital locked in a district that felt perpetually unfinished. There are workers whose employment ended overnight when the machinery went quiet. There are financial calculations that have never been made fully public, and a geopolitical arms race happening right now across the Arabian Peninsula that explains more about why this tower is moving again than any press release ever will. This is the story of the world's most expensive hole, who dug it, who paid for the silence, and why what fills it matters far beyond the skyline. To understand how a project this ambitious ends up as a $1 billion cavity in the ground, you have to go back to April 2016. That's when Mohammed Al-Abar, chairman of MR Properties, stood at a press conference in what would become Creek Harbor and announced something genuinely audacious, even by Dubai's considerable standards. The tower would be taller than the Burj Khalifa, not slightly taller, meaningfully, definitively taller. At a height that was deliberately left imprecise in the early announcements, a strategic ambiguity that architects and journalists speculated about for months, Creek Tower would become the defining vertical landmark of the 21st century. The implied figure that circulated through the industry put it above 1,300 meters, which would make it not just the tallest building, but the tallest structure humanity had ever erected. The architect was Santiago Calatrava, the Spanish-Swiss designer whose portfolio reads like a catalogue of the structurally improbable. His buildings don't look like buildings. They look like arguments that gravity is a negotiation rather than a rule. His design for Creek Tower was a slender, tapering needle, with a series of rotating platforms ascending its height, organic in its geometry, unmistakable from any angle. Renders of the completed structure produced a particular kind of awe that is rare even in an era of aggressive architectural imagery. The location was deliberate and strategic. Dubai Creek Harbor covers roughly 6 square kilometers on the southern end of Ras Al Khor, flanked by a wildlife sanctuary. That gives the district a natural boundary and a visual contrast that no other development zone in Dubai possesses. The tower was not intended simply as a showpiece. It was the spine of an entire urban ecosystem. MR's published vision for Creek Harbor included projections of 200,000 eventual residents, over 300 hotels, and a retail, cultural, and hospitality infrastructure designed to position the district as the successor to downtown Dubai. The tower was the anchor that made the rest of the development's value proposition coherent. The announced cost was approximately $1 billion. Completion, according to Amar's public timeline, was targeted for Expo 2020. That was the plan. What actually happened is a more complicated story. By late 2019, the excavation work at Creek Harbor had produced one of the largest and most technically demanding foundation preparations in Dubai's construction history. The site sits close to water, which created soil conditions that push the limits of conventional engineering solutions. The sheer volume of material moved, the depth of the excavation, the complexity of the ground treatment required. It was genuinely unprecedented work, and it showed in the scale of the pit that had been created. But people who lived and worked near the site, and contractors who had business relationships with the supply chain, noticed something in the rhythm of activity. Construction projects of this scale have a kind of industrial heartbeat, a predictable, escalating cadence of procurement, delivery, specialist contractor mobilization, and visible upward progress. By late 2019, according to multiple accounts in regional trade publications, that cadence had become irregular. Equipment movements were slowing. Certain specialist contractor teams that had been expected on site had not arrived. Officially, everything was proceeding. MR maintained consistent public messaging through 2019 and into early 2020. The project was on track, foundations were progressing, the timeline was being managed. Then COVID-19 arrived, and it provided a clean, universally understood, completely legitimate explanation for what happened next. Construction sites across the world shut down in March and April of 2020. Supply chains fractured globally. Labor workforces were repatriated. Creek Tower paused, along with hundreds of other projects in dozens of countries, and the pandemic absorbed the story. But industry analysts who track MR's financial disclosures and investor communications closely, and there is a small, dedicated community of people who do exactly this, have pointed to signals in the pre-pandemic record that complicate the neat narrative. Procurement activity at the site had been softening before the virus arrived. The specificity of timeline language in MR's investor materials had been moderating through late 2019. Multiple sources within Dubai's construction and real estate sectors, speaking to various regional and international outlets on background over the subsequent years, have suggested that the financial mathematics of Creek Tower had become challenging before the world had ever heard of a coronavirus. The original cost estimate, these sources argue, had been trending significantly upward as the engineering complexity of the project revealed itself in practice rather than in projection. The global infrastructure lending environment had also shifted between 2016 and 2019, tightening the terms available for capital-intensive projects of this ambition. None of this was confirmed officially. MR's public position remained consistent. The pause was temporary and operationally driven. The whole remained. 1 year passed, then 2, then 3, then 4. Here's what the press releases never addressed directly. A project of this scale doesn't simply pause, it bleeds. The sunk cost of the excavation and foundation preparation work represents capital deployed into the earth with zero return until the building is complete and revenue generating. Every month of inactivity generates carrying costs, site security obligations, maintenance of the preparatory work already completed, and the accumulating interest on any debt instruments associated with the financing. These costs are real, and they compound. The Creek Harbour District itself absorbed the consequences. The tower was never just a building. It was the narrative engine of an entire real estate ecosystem. Thousands of residential units in Creek Harbour had been sold off-plan, their value propositions built in significant part on the proximity and completion of the flagship project. Property consultancy data from the Dubai market in 2021 and 2022 showed that Creek Harbour units were trading at discounts relative to comparable addresses in downtown Dubai and Business Bay. Not dramatic discounts, but measurable ones, attributed by analysts in part to uncertainty about the district's central landmark. For buyers who had purchased in 2017 and 2018 on the strength of Creek Tower's projected timeline, this represented years of suspended expectation. Some were end users, families who had planned their domestic lives around a completed, amenity-rich neighborhood. Others were investors who had structured return projections around rental yields in a fully realized development. One such investor, speaking to a regional property publication in 2023 and asking not to be identified, described the experience in terms that have stayed with me. "You buy into a vision," they said. That sentence carries weight beyond this particular project. It describes a category of experience that a meaningful number of people who have participated in Dubai's more ambitious development zones have encountered at various points in the city's history. The gap between render and reality, between the announced timeline and the actual delivery is a risk that Dubai's market prices in imperfectly. The workers are a dimension of the story that rarely appears in the financial analyses. At peak excavation activity, the Creek Tower site employed hundreds of people: skilled engineers, specialist foundation contractors, heavy equipment operators, logistics personnel. When site activity wound down, those employment relationships ended. The specialist subcontractors, who had invested in equipment and staffing specifically for this project, absorbed losses that don't appear anywhere in Emar's consolidated accounts. Many of those workers moved on to other sites, other cities, other countries. The workforce continuity that large construction projects depend upon was interrupted in ways that have practical implications for how quickly the vertical phase can now accelerate. The question was never whether Creek Tower could be built. The engineering is extraordinary and unprecedented, but it has solutions. The question was always whether Dubai needed it badly enough to absorb what building it would actually cost. And sometime in the period between late 2022 and early 2024, that calculation shifted. Understanding why requires looking at 4 separate forces that converged with unusual timing. The first is the simplest. Dubai's economy performed, in the post-pandemic period, at a level that surprised even optimistic analysts. International visitor numbers in 2023 surpassed 17 million, the highest in the city's recorded history. Real estate values in premium districts reached historic peaks. The off-plan sales market, which is the mechanism through which projects like Creek Tower are substantially funded, pre-sales generating the cash flows that underwrite construction, was operating with extraordinary momentum. The financial foundation for a project of Creek Tower's scale is considerably stronger in 2024 than it was in 2019. The second force is geopolitical, and it is, frankly, the most clarifying one. 800 kilometers up the Arabian coast, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is executing the most aggressive urban construction program in human history. Vision 2030 is not a slogan or a branding exercise. It is a multi-trillion-dollar restructuring of a national economy, and its architectural ambitions are genuinely staggering. NEOM, Diriyah Gate, Qiddiya, the Red Sea Project. Saudi Arabia is building at a scale and pace that has genuinely unsettled urban planners and economists who study Gulf development dynamics. And then there is the Jeddah Tower. Designed to stand over 1,000 meters above sea level, it would, if completed, claim the title of world's tallest building from the Burj Khalifa. Construction on Jeddah Tower resumed in 2023 after its own extended pause. It is moving again, and the industry is watching its progress with close attention. For Dubai, this is not abstract competitive pressure. The Burj Khalifa is one of the most recognizable pieces of branding in the world. It is inseparable from Dubai's global identity in a way that almost nothing else is. The possibility of Saudi Arabia claiming the world's tallest building, not just claiming it, but doing so as part of a comprehensive repositioning of the entire kingdom as a global destination, creates a strategic urgency for Dubai that transcends real estate economics. Creek Tower, at its proposed height, would surpass Jeddah Tower. If it gets built, the superlative stays in Dubai. That matters enormously to a city whose entire international positioning has been constructed on the foundation of firsts and bests and tallests. The third force is the legacy of Expo 2020. The event itself has concluded, but it generated something durable. A demonstrated capacity for large-scale project delivery that satisfied the scrutiny of global institutional investors. Dubai proved, to an international audience that was watching closely, that it could execute at extraordinary scale under extraordinary circumstances. That track record translates into improved financing terms and investor confidence for subsequent mega projects. And the fourth is Calatrava's design itself. There is a reason the renders keep circulating years after the project paused. The tower, as designed, is exceptional in a way that relatively few structures in human history have been exceptional. Genuinely novel in its structural language, unmistakable in its silhouette, possessing that quality that the best architecture has of making people want to be near it. The observation experience that Creek Tower would offer, if the Burj Khalifa's performance is any guide, represents a revenue stream that financial analysts take seriously. The building isn't just a symbol, it's a business. You cannot understand Creek Tower's revival without looking 800 kilometers up the coast. But you also cannot fully understand it without understanding what the tower means to Dubai as a narrative proposition. This is a city that has built its entire identity on the refusal of limits. Every major landmark in Dubai's modern history was greeted, at the announcement stage, with serious and credible skepticism. The Burj Khalifa, too tall, structurally impossible at that height, financially reckless. The Pam Jumeirah, the ocean doesn't accommodate land reclamation at that scale. The indoor ski slope in a desert. The museum shaped like a Mobius strip hovering above the ground. In each case, the skeptics were not unreasonable. They were applying the logic of precedent to a city that operated outside of precedent. And in each case, the city built the thing anyway. Creek Tower became, during its years of silence, an uncomfortable counter-narrative to that history. The whole was visible evidence that Dubai had, on at least one occasion, encountered a limit. Proof that even this city's ambitions could outrun its execution. That's a story Dubai's leadership and its commercial establishment have strong motivation to rewrite. And the rewriting happens by filling the hole. The audience for that rewriting is not primarily tourists or architecture enthusiasts. It is the global investment community. The sovereign wealth funds, the institutional real estate buyers, the multinational corporations that make location decisions based partly on their confidence in a city's ability to follow through on its stated intentions. Creek Tower's revival is, among other things, a credibility statement aimed at the most consequential audience Dubai has. Not everyone had the luxury of waiting for the right moment. The investors who bought into Creek Harbor in those early years of the project's life made their decisions based on information and timelines that subsequently changed in ways they couldn't have fully anticipated. Some held, some sold at discounts. Some are still holding, years into a wait that was never supposed to be this long. The experience is not unique to Creek Harbor. Off-plan investment in any major development carries delivery risk, and Dubai's regulatory framework has evolved over the decades to provide investors with progressively better protections. But the scale of the delay and the profile of the project made this situation more visible than most. There's a broader pattern worth acknowledging here. Dubai has, over its history of ambitious development, created significant value for investors who participated in its vision and stayed committed through the execution phase. It has also created periods of significant stress for people who needed returns on specific timelines, and found that those timelines had quietly shifted. The Creek Harbor experience sits in that second category, and the revival of the project doesn't automatically restore what the delay cost the people who were living with that uncertainty. The workers are owed an acknowledgement too. The men and women who were on that site during its active phase. The engineers managing unprecedented ground conditions. The laborers doing physically demanding work in Dubai's climate. The specialist contractors who had structured their businesses around this project's schedule. Their story is largely invisible in the coverage of the revival. The construction sector in the Gulf depends on a vast labor force, whose welfare and working conditions have been the subject of significant international attention over recent years. That attention is warranted, and it applies here as much as anywhere. Let's be honest about the obstacles, because they deserve more than a footnote. The engineering challenges of Creek Tower are real and significant in ways that are not fully appreciated in general coverage of the project. Designing a foundation and structural system for a building of this height, in these specific soil conditions, with the water proximity considerations that Creek Harbor presents, is genuinely without close precedent. The problems have solutions. Calatrava's team and the engineers working with Amar are operating at the absolute frontier of structural capability, but they are not working without tools. The solutions exist. They require time, testing, and an iterative construction process that cannot be rushed without creating risk. The cost environment has also changed substantially since 2016. Specialized high-strength steel in the quantities a project like this requires, the proprietary concrete mixes necessary for a structure of this height, the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems. For a building that will house observation decks, hospitality facilities, and potentially residential components at extreme heights, all of these inputs have experienced significant price increases over the past 8 years. The revised total project cost has not been publicly disclosed by Emaar, but construction industry analysts who have modeled the project have estimated figures that are considerably higher than the original billion-dollar announcement. There is also the question of timeline honesty. Emaar has, notably, not committed to a specific completion date in its recent public communications. That absence is itself informative. It reflects, most observers agree, the lessons of the previous cycle. The company is not repeating the Expo 2020 deadline mistake. But it also means that the people evaluating this project's progress have fewer concrete benchmarks to measure against. Realistically, Creek Tower is a project of the 2030s. The Jeddah Tower, which is at a more advanced construction stage, is estimated by industry observers to be at minimum 5 to 7 years from completion. Creek Tower, beginning its vertical phase later, would logically require a comparable or longer timeline. The economic conditions, the geopolitical dynamics, the leadership priorities that are driving the project forward today will need to remain coherent through a decade of execution. That is a genuine risk that any honest assessment must acknowledge. Here's what I keep returning to when I look at the full arc of this. The Creek Tower pause was not, in the final analysis, a failure. It was a calculation, whether explicitly decided or tacitly allowed, an acknowledgement that the conditions for success needed to mature before the real commitment could be sustained. Dubai has played long games before. Projects that appeared stalled or abandoned have come back at the right moment and delivered things that changed the city's skyline and its story. The city has a genuine track record of patience deployed strategically. What was different about Creek Tower was the visibility. The hole was simply too large, too symbolic, and too centrally located to function as a quiet administrative deferral. It became, for years, the most prominent piece of evidence available to anyone who wanted to argue that Dubai's ambitions had, at last, outpaced its execution. That reputational cost was real, and the revival of the project is, among many other things, a deliberate response to that cost. The activity at the site is real. The change in Emaar's communications is real. The geopolitical and economic logic driving the revival is coherent, and to the serious observers who track this sector, compelling. For the first time in years, the people who know this industry best are treating Creek Tower as a live project rather than a managed legacy obligation. If that assessment proves correct, if, a decade from now, Calatrava's extraordinary needle stands above Creek Harbor and holds the world's tallest title against everything Saudi Arabia has built and will build, then the story of the pause will transform. The billion-dollar hole will become a chapter in a longer story about how Dubai's most ambitious project navigated its most complicated decade and emerged as something genuinely extraordinary. That is Dubai's bet, and this city has made bigger ones before and won. What do you think? Is Creek Tower genuinely on a path to completion this time, or is this another chapter before the next pause? If you've been following this project since the 2016 announcement, or if you visited Creek Harbor and seen the site yourself, I want to hear from you in the comments. Seriously, drop your perspective below, because the people closest to these developments always know things that the official narrative misses. And if this kind of analysis, the story behind the story, the financial and geopolitical currents underneath the architectural spectacle, is what you're looking for, there is considerably more coming. The Gulf is in the middle of a building campaign that will define the visual landscape of the next century, and we're tracking it in real time. Subscribe and hit the bell, because the next chapter of this story is already being written.